Hello, my dear friends. Hello, my dear listeners. How are you all? I hope you are doing best to serve your duties with utmost honesty and love. And today I am here to proceed our journey farther through the life of our master, Shri Ramakrishna Paramhansa Dev. So, we are going to know what Shivnath Shastri has written or had written as per his point of view about Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa Dev. Let's proceed, but before that, I must I must read this footnote. To avoid any possible misconstruction, a word of explanation is necessary with regard to Sri Ramakrishna's favorite expression, Kamini Kanchan, meaning literally woman and gold. Needless to say, he used it in a general sense, meaning sex, attraction, and wealth. The use of the word Kamini does not imply any hatred for women. He used it because he was addressing men. When addressing women, he always substituted the word Purusha or man, showing clearly that he meant the sex instinct. Sometimes he actually used the more comprehensive phrase Kama Kanchana, that is, lust and gold. So now we should proceed in the next part. I was present, he writes. Here he means Shivnath Sastri. On occasions when coins were placed in his hand by an inquiring visitor as an experiment, the saint would go into one of his usual trances and would remain unconscious until they were removed. Shivnath's religion did not require a man to renounce the world altogether. It sought to reconcile the world and God. So it was difficult for him to understand the full significance of Sri Ramakrishna's life of unimpeccable purity and renunciation of lust. He writes Ramakrishna was practically separated from his wife who lived in her village home. One day, when I was complaining to some friends about the virtual widowhood of his wife, he drew me to one side and whispered in my ear, "Why do you complain? It is no longer possible. It is all dead and gone." Another time, as I was inveighing against this part of his teaching and also declaring that our program of work in the Brahmo Samaj includes women, that ours is a social and domestic religion, and that we want to give education and social liberty to women, the saint became very much excited, as it was his fashion when anything against his settled conviction was asserted, a trait we so much liked in him, and exclaimed, "Oh, go, thou fool! Go and perish in the pit that your woman will dig for you." Then he glared at me and said, "What does a gardener do with a young plant? Does he not surround it with a fence to protect it from goats and cattle? And when the young plant has grown up into a tree and it can no longer be injured by cattle, does he not remove the fence and let the tree grow freely?" I replied, "Yes, that is the custom with gardeners." Then he remarked, "Do the same in your spiritual life. Shun woman in the beginning of that life. Become strong, be full grown, then you may seek them." To which I replied, "I don't agree with you in thinking that woman's work is like that of cattle, destructive. They are our associates and helpers in all our spiritual struggles and social progress." A view with which he could not agree, and he marked his dissent by shaking his head. Then, referring to the closing time, he jocularly remarked, It is time for you to depart. Take care, do not be late, otherwise your woman will not admit you into her room. This evoked hearty laughter. In his reminiscence, Pandit Shivnath speaks in glowing terms of Sri Ramakrishna's love for him. On many occasions, the master clasped him to his bosom and requested him again and again to come to Dakshineshwar. Once, when he failed to come after repeated invitations, the master went to see him. Such was his intense love for all who tried to lead a religious life. But in spite of his close intimacy, Pandit Shivnath had a strange idea about the master's transcendental state or loss of outward consciousness in samadhi. He saw in it only the outcome of a strange nervous disorder under which, whenever there was any strong emotion or excitement, he would faint, losing consciousness for the time being, while his whole countenance assumed a radiant glow as a sign of the emotion working within. He had heard about Sri Ramakrishna's great austerities, especially as regards food and sleep, and therefore concluded that his trances were but the after effect austere life he had led during his youth. Nevertheless, he classified these fits of Sri Ramakrishna with those of Chaitanya, Muhammad, and many other saints of a devotional temperament, thinking that too great intimacy with Sri Ramakrishna was responsible for the spiritual revolution in the mind of Vijay, which made him leave the Brahmo Samaj. Shivnath was anxious to ward off his unwholesome influence as he thought it to be from his Samaj. Asked why he no longer frequented the Kali temple at Dakshineshwar, he replied that if he did so, other members of his Samaj would follow his example, and as a result, the organization would collapse. Sri Ramakrishna heard of Shivnath's views and seeing him one day at Dakshineshwar said to him, "Well, Shivnath, I hear that you call my samadhi a disease and say that I become unconscious at that time. You think day and night of all sorts of material things and yet consider yourself to be of sound brain, while I, who meditate on the eternal fountainhead of consciousness, appear to you as deranged, a fine piece of reasoning." Shivnath had nothing to say. One outstanding feature of Sri Ramakrishna's character was his extreme simplicity and utter abhorrence of show. He was the mother's child, an instrument upon which the Divine Mother was playing, except in exalted moods when he lost his own individuality in the absorbing personality of the Mother. He could not bear to hear himself praised. Another point of importance in connection with him was that he was literally all things to all men. Those closely associated with him knew of hundreds of instances where he suited his conversation to the mentality of the person addressed. For instance, he never spoke of Janana to a Bhakta. If he were discoursing on the unreality of life with a Janani and a Bhakta happened to come in, he would change the subject at once and speak of the world as being real, the manifestation of the Lord. For he knew that while the Janani would not object to the interpretation of the world from the standpoint of bhakti, the devotee might be shocked to hear that the universe was unreal. His one idea was to help everyone towards the goal without disturbing his or her particular line of thought. This endeared him to all. Everyone saw in him the fulfillment of his own mode of sadhana, and he was in reality the consummation of them all. The following quotation from Shivnath's book illustrates the point. I was seated with him. He writes, when a number of rich men from Calcutta arrived, the saint, in the midst of the conversation, went out of the room for some minutes. In the meantime, Hriday, his nephew and caretaker, began to extol his uncle before these men, narrating some of his great performances, referring to the period of his greatest fervor. He said, so great was his love of God that he became insensible to all outward circumstances of life, apparently dead to all external events for some time. Just at that moment, Sri Ramakrishna entered the room. He heard Hriday's last words and took him to task for trying to magnify him before others. The words I remember vividly. What a mean spirited fellow you must be to extol me thus before these rich men! You have seen their costly apparel and their gold watches and chains, and your object is to extract from them as much money as you can. What do I care what they think of me? Then, turning to the men, he said, no, my friends, what he has told you about me is not true. It was not love of God it was not love of God that made me absorbed and indifferent to external life. I became positively insane for some time. The sadhus who frequented this temple told me to practice many things. I tried to follow them, and the consequence was my austerities drove me to insanity. Pandit Shivnath took these words literally and so failed to understand their real import. So, my dear friends, today I am stopping here. But before ending this episode, I must say we have to make ourselves remember that last and somehow last for the sex or physical intimacy as well as last for wealth is, or I must say, last for anything is very bad. And I think our master was very much aware of it, and he was there to mention this point to each of his followers or listener, whoever or wherever is listening this. So with this, I wish that we must bar off from anything in excess in our life except bhakti, truth, and okay, let's conclude this episode with the three simple words Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. That actually concludes everything. Let's make everything of our life be Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. So, with this, be happy, be jolly, and keep praying. Ta ta!